So, bacteria that's antibiotic resistant, do they continually stay antibiotic resistant, or can they change in their makeup? How does that happen?
Okay, and so I'm going to avoid trying to get too technical, but the thing we need to remember is that many of these bacteria divide. That is, their intergenerational time is as little as 20 minutes. So when we talk about a bacterium, recognize that there's a bacterium, but if we come back in 2 hours, it's not the same bacterium, but its lineage continues, because when they divide, they're basically replicating their genetic makeup. So bacteria can acquire resistance through plasmids, through mutations. They can also theoretically lose resistance over time. The loss of resistance is not as common as we might think, and there's a reason for this, that the plasmids, even though they're not free-living organisms unto themselves, have ways of making themselves necessary for their new host bacterium. And that involves something somewhat complicated called toxin-antitoxin. Basically, it says that once the plasmid gets in, it tries to make itself essential to the life of its host. And so if those plasmids have resistance genes and that host becomes dependent on the plasmid, it will never lose the resistance. But all is not lost, because over time, if the antibiotic selection pressure disappears, those bacteria that have this plasmid lose an advantage, and over time they will disappear. So bacteria themselves, because they have such a short lifespan, it's only their offspring that we care about, and many, many generations of offsprings. And the question becomes, do they continue to have those traits, or can they lose them? And they can lose them, but more often, if those traits start to be a disadvantage instead of an advantage, they will disappear. So the resistance elements have been around for millions of years, and we have several recent studies looking at permafrost, 30,000 years old. Antibiotics have only been used by humans for 70 years now. And so any resistance that we find from millions of years or millennia ago wasn't selected for by our use. Sure enough, those genes exist. You can go into caves. A recent study out of McMaster University in Canada identified bacteria from caves that supposedly were inaccessible, that represent bacteria going back, I think, 2 million years or so. And the resistance genes, the resistance to macrolides, to tetracyclines, even to some of the beta-lactamases are present. And the beta-lactams include penicillin. And since penicillin is produced by mold, it shouldn't surprise us that we can find resistance. So it's there, but does that mean that humans haven't had an impact on it? Of course we have. What we do is we select for much higher levels of resistance than you would otherwise find. So you can find it anywhere. The question is, why do we see so much more in intensive care units of hospitals? And it's because we use antibiotics intensely. People are highly susceptible. They're staying there. They're large number, or the density of the housing is quite intense. So that's where we see resistance rise exponentially versus background levels in uninhabited caves, for example.
Within communities, and you mentioned intensive care units as where we see resistance. Where are other locations within communities that we may see resistance? That's
the most studied, and of course, many of the infections that we see in the community today, we didn't see 20 or 30 years ago. And methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, or MRSA, is a good example. In the late 1960s and 70s, it was typically hospital-acquired. When patients were released from the hospital, even if they left with Staph aureus that were resistant to methicillin, those Staph aureus were outcompeted in the community. And then we started to see patients who came back to hospitals that still had the Staph aureus. And then eventually we saw community-acquired methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. So the progression was the bacteria became more and more fit in terms of their ability to compete in the broader community. And so we saw those situations where it spread from the hospital to the community. Now the question is, in the community, are there areas where it's more prevalent? And I think more than more prevalent, it has to do with, where risk factors increase. So in athletics departments, in gyms, where individuals are, sweaty, and so on, we can see an increase in acquisition of these particular bacteria. I'm not sure it means that there's a higher prevalence, but there's a higher level of risk factor for individual acquisition.
And what are some common things that can be done to reduce those risk factors in those, places like locker rooms?
Right, and so those tend to be issues of transmission. So reducing transmission, there's been a number of modeling studies that have shown that actually hygienic practices, hand washing by caregivers who are working in intensive care units between patients, will have an outsized impact on reducing resistant bacteria over susceptible bacteria. And if we argue the point that if you're going to have an infection, you'd rather it be of a susceptible bacterium rather than a resistant bacterium, that's something you want to encourage. So hygienic practices, both in the hospital as well as in the community, not sharing towels, wiping down benches, even though one could argue that some of these things seem a little ridiculous, especially compared to what we got away with 20 or 30 years ago, they go a long way towards reducing risk.